what these debates are about, oh, the euro, what a terrible idea, and why would governments be so stupid as to all adopt the same currency to realise that something went wrong? They couldn't, like, devalue their currency and export their way out of it. What a bunch of fucking idiots. So, I think it's worth going back to the start to say there was actually some pretty good reasons why the euro was created. And that doesn't mean it should last forever, but that does mean that it wasn't like the world's most colossal clusterfuck, even if that's what it may have possibly turned into. So very crudely, simply, in one slide, try to summarise using the smallest words why the euro was created in the first place. There were essentially kind of three groups of people who were most relevant to the debates we have today, who also had important decisions to make about why the euro was created. Obviously, there are a number of members of the EMU, like the Northern European countries, who are excluded from this discussion, but they're also not in trouble, so they don't really care. Obviously, Germany was the critical player in forming the euro for the very simple reason that Germany is by far the largest economy in Europe. And remembering that the euro was created in the 1990s, it was pretty much shortly after Europe had been sort of fully reunified and become a singular country. And there was a lot of concern in European countries about what this new doubled in size powerhouse German country would do. And we think about Germany as being a big part of Europe now, and it seems inseparable. But in the 1990s, it was unclear about which direction Germany was going to go in. Was it going to see itself as being embedded deeply in Europe's future, or was it going to kind of go it alone as an economic superpower like a Japan or a US or whatever, and not see itself necessarily as being tied to the fate of its region? And so from Germany's point of view, they had to trade off, obviously being tied more closely to a range of countries in different economic circumstances to them, but they also got a range of benefits. The first means they obviously secured access to new markets, because sharing the same currency and having a bunch of rules that went along with that made it much, much easier for them to export into those countries. And Germany's economic model in the modern age, if not always, has been heavily driven around export-orientated growth. So to be an exporter means you have someone to export to, so having rules that made that easy was obviously very attractive. It meant they got to impose rules on neighbouring countries who, whether they were linked to them directly or not, their success or failure could have implications for Germany, so having them have a bunch of rules that they didn't think they would like very much but might suck up, imposing them was a good idea. And it prevented them from getting into currency wars with southern European countries, who by and large operate on really a completely different kind of economic model to Germany. They're not export-orientated largely, although they do export a bit. Countries like Greece don't have huge export economies, even for the size of their economy. But nevertheless, it's always tempting for those southern European countries in the 80s and 90s to devalue their currencies just to kind of undercut German manufacturers and to get into marketplaces where they didn't have niche interests. So Germany got to basically lock out the whole of Europe from being able to undercut them just using currency as a device, which was pretty cool for them. For France, who were the other country with kind of the biggest amount to gain or lose from a Europe, because they're the second largest economy in Europe, they were most concerned about where Germany was going to go. And France is in a really kind of love-hate relationship with Germany. They wanted the benefits of having close relations with Germany and Germany being tied into Europe, because it would be an engine of growth that they would benefit from as well. But they were worried that Germany would dominate a more integrated European Union, and that they would exert a massive influence, and that France, despite being the second most powerful country nominally in Europe, would end up being sidelined by the power of Germany. And in particular at that time, the German central bank, the Bundesbank, was already starting to exert great interest in the region. And so France's idea was that if we could create this unified monetary union, create a European central bank, that would create a counterbalance to the German Bundesbank and give the French more say, because they'd be able to influence the decisions of the European Central Bank much more than they could influence the decisions of the German Central Bank. And of course, the southern European countries, you might think, why would they want to adopt a whole bunch of rules, which they obviously did, some of them didn't have much desire to follow. And for them, it was a whole bunch of things like much greater currency stability. These countries are much, much smaller, have far less currency volume weight than places like Germany, so were far more prone to destabilisation of their currencies, sort of Asian financial crisis style. But linking into one big currency that was very deep and liquid meant that was very likely to happen for them. It meant they also got reciprocal access to German and French markets, which are very significant to them because they're much larger than their own. And very importantly, because of the nature of the southern European economies, they got much, much lower borrowing rates. Because being tied into Europe meant not having that currency speculation, meant that they could get access to cheaper rates, because lenders weren't worried that their currencies were going to suddenly be devalued, which would harm their capacity to pay back their loans, make it less likely they would pay them back. But it also meant that having the rules imposed upon them that the EMU involved made lenders more confident that Southern European countries would pay back their debts. So that deeply helped, because Southern Europe's economic model is really much more heavily geared towards government involvement in the economy, much more interventionist government, which is expensive, so borrowing rates are important. as a general principle, the idea behind the euro crisis was that you would have independent monetary policy, independent from the politics of those countries, so you get a European central bank. And we've talked today about why independent monetary policy is a good thing, bad thing, depending on where you sit on those things. And the role of the European Central Bank will be highly limited. So we talked before today about how traditionally European central banks have two roles, that they set interest rates and they have the capacity to issue bonds and to be involved in monetary supply in that way. But the European Central Bank cannot do that, cannot issue bonds. And technically speaking, it's not supposed to buy sovereign debt from EU member countries, so there are some ways around that. And Mario Draghi has actually implemented some of those things without getting around it. It would mean that fiscal policy in those countries would be constrained by the Growth and Stability Pact, which set limits on how much debt to GDP ratio countries could have, how much inflation they could rack up, all that sort of stuff. Those limits are there. And so for those people who think that debt in Australia is out of control because we're at something like 15% debt to GDP ratio or something, the Europeans were totally cool with 60%, which I don't think Australia has come anywhere near 60% debt to GDP ratio in like forever. So, we have a very distorted view of debt ratios in Australia because we're traditionally a very low debt country, but that just means that we're more sensitive to small fluctuations in debt than perhaps we need to be. And what that meant was once the European Monetary Union was created and the euro was formed, that bond prices across the euro, so these aren't bonds issued by the ECB because that's not allowed, but bonds issued by EMU members, by Greece and Spain and Germany, these guys, all started to converge in terms of their long-term bond yield. Which is basically the market saying, we think all you countries are now the same in terms of your risk profile. We're going to treat you all as being essentially the same. They didn't quite entirely converge, but they very closely converged. And so that had some impact we'll see later on. Does everybody understand that? There was actually a pretty good case for why the EMU exists. All those things are still true, by the way, so when you're doing your arguments about whether or not the euro should be broken up or not, those things are all basically still there. In some cases, they're stronger than they were. So, let's get into it. What happened in the European financial crisis? So, the first thing is you've got to start with Greece. Greece kicks it off. Greece is obviously the worst example. So, Greece has been a high debt country for a long time. Some of those rules, like the 60% debt to GDP ratio, they were clearly talking to you, Greece, when they had those rules in place. But bear in mind, you can view that as, well, the Greek government's just profligate and they never got their act together and they weren't disciplined and whatever other bullshit we use. But also partly it's that the Greek model involved a lot of government intervention, high social welfare nets, high government pensions had to be paid for by rolling debt to make sure that the government could make good on its obligations. That's not necessarily automatically bad, but you've got to be able to pay your bills. So Greece was already rocking around at above 100%, I think it was 115% when they joined the EU, but the great benefit to them was they immediately got access to lower borrowing rates. So this is like having a big credit card debt and then someone coming along like a bank saying, well, we'll lend you money to cover your credit card debt, and instead of your credit card debt at 17.5% or whatever is average, we'll give you a 6% interest rate. So they suddenly got to just take the same amount of money, pay a hell of a lot less in interest payments, which meant they could deal with those debts a lot more quickly. So those lower bond rates and trade surpluses from Germany, which meant that there was a lot of investment coming out of Germany. Germany's been racking up massive trade surpluses against other European countries, not necessarily globally, meant that there was a huge amount of money just pouring into Greece. Money out of the bond market, which are now much more interested in them, and money from countries like Germany, who have German investors and the German central bank looking for places to park their money. That led to a whole lot of overinvestment in Greece and a bit of a housing bubble amongst other things. So what we didn't know until the government in Greece changed in 2009 was that the government had been massively and unprecedentedly cooking the books. So people thought Greece's economy was kind of a bit precarious and there was a lot of debt, not a lot of desire to pay that debt off. What we found out was it was exactly twice as bad as we thought. So, literally. So the new government came in and said, actually we don't have 150% debt to GDP, we have about 300% debt to GDP. And the markets went insane, and bond yields exploded, and people started calling in their debts, and a cascade clusterfuck starts to occur. Things start to spiral out of control. So this is where the policy debate starts to kick in, right? We need to move from the causes to what happens next. And so the EU is now faced with a choice. Greece is starting to kind of collapse in like a house of cards. What's the European Union supposed to do? And what we know about this crisis is, yes, the Greeks got themselves into a bit of a mess, but in large part what makes the Greek situation unique is that it's very clear the Greek government went to extraordinary lengths to hide from the population the true extent of the mess that they were in by like a very large factor. So if you're a policymaker, you've got to decide how to hold people responsible for their decisions. Do you hold people who were fooled into making a decision twice as bad as they thought it was, equal to the way you would treat someone who, with eyes open, went in and did something bad. Well, the Europeans said, yeah, we don't really care about all this kind of, you got tricked into this shit stuff, we're going to slap you down pretty hard. And they went in very aggressively to save Greek banks, but at the expense, basically, of the Greek population, because the conditions for the IMF EU bailouts were very strict austerity. Now, you might view that as just a reflection of economic orthodoxy and right-wing economic thinking kind of prevailing in Europe, maybe. You might view that as Europe being dominated by Germany, German banks having massive exposure to Greek banks because that's where they parked all their money, and so Germany being much more worried about Greek banks than they were about Greek people, maybe. Or you might just say it was the right thing to do. But in any case, these are all very complicated. So Greece has now got itself in a real mess. Unemployment's at around 25%. It's much higher for youth in that sector, which is particularly pernicious. Salaries for public servants have been slashed dramatically to try to bring down government expenditure, but also to engage in a bit of an internal devaluation, which we talked about before. And as we've already said, suicide rates have doubled. That brings us to Ireland, and I didn't want to do a separate slide for Spain, so I've just crushed them all together because they're basically in the same situation. So we jump from Greece, who you might, slightly uncharitably say are in a mess mostly of their own making. Ireland and Spain are a totally different story. This is what's important to understand. Greece is not the US, it's not one single economy that did one set of good or bad set of policies. Each different European country who's been caught up in this crisis has got there through a quite different path. Ireland and Spain have never had debt problems. In fact, I think from memory that Ireland's the only country that's never breached the debt rules of the EU the entire time it's been a member of the EU. It's been a poster child for the European Union in many ways. I mean that quite sincerely. We'll talk later on about some of the ways in which a stimulus program in Europe could work. And Ireland's always been a great example because what the EU did in the early years was to have an investment regime where newer members received a huge amount of support from existing members to help them develop. And Ireland basically leapfrogged from being an agriculture-based economy to being a kind of high-tech finance centre in the span of about 15 years, largely because of massive amounts of money from Europe. So it's always been a real poster child for European success. Spain, similarly, didn't really get itself into that much trouble either, except the problem is when the global financial crisis hit, which was coming out of the US and then folding into Europe after Greece, the banks froze up and Ireland found itself in deep trouble. So even though the economy is not, if you should just pull the economy of Ireland out and make it its own universe, it was totally fine, but the banks that were interconnected into the Irish economy froze, and so that meant that Ireland was in pretty deep shit. So the government tried to move quickly to end the panic, because remember we talked about with the US that in a lot of cases, particularly if you're from the kind of Krugman view of the world, half of these crises are crises of confidence, and when the crisis of confidence gets out of control, then the effects on the real economy become huge. So Ireland tried to move very quickly, and they promised to guarantee all the debt that the banks are holding in these foreign banks that have now collapsed, in the thought that that would mean the markets would say, phew, problem solved, right? No, can't go wrong. Either the banks will pay back the debt or the government will, but no reason to panic. Well, panic doesn't work like that, and panic spread, and the market ignored the Irish government's guarantee, or called their bluff, if you want to prefer to think of it that way, and Irish banks collapsed, and the government had to take on the debt. One was nationalised, the rest were restructured, and Ireland that had been running effectively zero debt, then suddenly jumped to 32% debt, which was a huge increase for them and massively impacted on their borrowing costs. Spain responded to the crisis in a different way. Spain went straight for austerity and said, yep, we'll be okay, we'll pay back our debts and that we've incurred from supporting our banks by engaging in as much austerity as we can. They desperately tried to avoid getting into an EU IMF bailout. They wanted to do austerity on their own terms, which was laudable, but perhaps self-defeating. The problem for them was they needed to grow their way out of the problem. They couldn't pay back their debts if their economy was shrinking, and austerity had exactly that effect. And while the austerity advocates would have said, well, if you just stuck with it long enough, growth would have come roaring back, in the short term, their revenues imploded, and that made it very difficult for them to borrow, which meant their risk premiums went up. So in Ireland, unemployment is officially at 11.3%, although the IMF earlier this week disputed that and said that Ireland's concealing the fact that actually its unemployment rate's closer to 24% because it's including people who are basically doing any amount of work at all in the category of people who are employed, when actually if you're taking people who are seriously underemployed, you get a rate that's closer to about 24%. So in other words, either of those numbers are diabolical, but 24 is a terrible, terrible number. It's higher in Spain, and it's incredibly high for youth in Spain. So you can see these are extremely, extremely high numbers that have massive impacts. Portugal's an even sadder story than Ireland and Spain in a way, because Portugal did even less wrong than Ireland and Spain. Ireland at least had banks that were deeply globally connected, and maybe that was too much risk and they should have been more careful in who they were tied up with. All Portugal did wrong was to be located somewhere near Portugal. And basically, there's no evidence that Portugal was running unsustainable budgets or had deeply overly generous public sectors or hugely inflexible labour laws. But Portugal's closely linked to Spain, and as Spain's economy started to implode, markets just kind of assumed that sooner or later it would fall over onto Portugal for reasons that are both reasonable and totally superstitious. And in the sense that markets always are self-fulfilling prophecies. If the markets worry, then markets tank. The markets decided that Portugal was in trouble. Pretty quickly, Portugal got itself in trouble because the markets were letting them up higher. The Portuguese government again tried to jump on this very quickly to assert confidence. Instead to the populations who were looking at what was happening in Spain and freaking out that the government was going to engage in full-scale austerity imposed upon them by IMF EU bailout, and said there will be no bailout. Portugal is fine. We have not done terrible things. Our economy is not fucked. Portugal will be cool. A few weeks later, Portugal required a bailout.
Yeah, well, the real problem for Portugal I read ages ago was apparently their foreign asset ownership is so massive. So pretty much all their major businesses are owned by other countries. So a lot of the revenue that would be used for the state to fix that, people on the ground don't get a lot of the proceeds of business doing well. A lot of it's the profits of business ownership go overseas.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's maybe the one reason why the markets were not totally out of line.
Sorry to interrupt. Another quick example of that, just to, I know you're all laughing, but it's genuinely true, was South Korea in the Asian financial crisis, who, genuinely the only reason their economy plummeted was racism. There was just an assumption because they were Asian, they would also be affected, even though the interlinkages with, Thailand and other places were very minimal. And a prime example being Australia wasn't affected, despite having equally little linkages to Asia, or equally the same amount of linkages to those countries. So, sometimes the market's just crazy.
Yeah. So Portugal's been hit just as hard, if not harder. If you look at unemployment at the moment, 17.5% and a staggering 54% per year. So a country that shouldn't really get very much wrong has had its teeth kicked in. Cyprus is the more recent version of this, and for those who are wondering, that's sorry in Russian. Cyprus has been the more recent victim of all this, and Cyprus in a way is a kind of unique situation that wouldn't have really become as big an issue if it hadn't been tied up in the European situation, i.e. no one would have paid that much attention to Cyprus's crash because it's such a tiny, tiny economy, except because it's in Europe, it's South Korea's in Asia, right? Cyprus is in Europe, which means everybody gets to speculate what this means for the rest of the European problem. So Cyprus is tiny, whereas places like Spain could actually potentially bring down other countries in Europe if they totally collapse because Spain's economy is reasonably large by regional standards. Cyprus's is 0.5 of 1% of the EU's GDP or something, so totally tiny. But it's always had a massive, always in recent decades, had a massive banking sector, and it set itself up as a kind of Mediterranean financial hub, a kind of Singapore in southern Europe, and to the extent to which Cayman Islands.
Cayman Island.
So the estimates are that the size of the banking sector was somewhere between 5 and 7 times the entire GDP of the island. So the banks were huge, which is the same situation that Iceland was in right during the crisis. It had these banks that were on their own, much bigger than the rest of the economy combined. Which is not so bad. I mean, if you're a small place like Cyprus, you've got to specialise in something. They decided to specialise in taking Russian people's money and hiding it. That seemed to go pretty well. Cypriot banks were flush with Russian cash mostly, but also cash from the rest of Europe, which they then liberally splashed around the world in cheap debt, which meant as Cyprus's banks got into trouble during the global financial crisis, the rest of Europe started to wonder just how deep are the tentacles of this going to go. So what makes Cyprus unique and important to this conversation is that they did receive a bailout, but under incredibly unique circumstances. And the first round of bailout negotiations said that all bank depositors in Cyprus would be required to make a contribution to the cost of the bailout, which is a polite way of saying that every taxpayer would get hit by having their bank accounts raided by the government, who were required to do that to keep the IMF and the EU happy enough to donate some money to them, which had not even been discussed in any other European country in their bailouts, let alone ever come close to implementing. People in Cyprus understandably went a tad berserk at waking up in the morning to be told that they would have, in some cases, 10% of their private bank accounts raided overnight without any prospect of appeal or without any, that necessarily having had any involvement in anything to do with any of this stuff. These are just people running businesses or buying homes, all that sort of stuff. So after a massive protest, the bailout terms were renegotiated, and now only people who have 100,000 euros or more in their accounts will get rated, but those people could lose as much as 60% of what they hold. Some of that money is turned into bank shares, which if the banks don't survive will be worthless. Others are turned into special purpose loans, which will only generate interest if the banks generate a certain level of interest and support, and then the rest they'll keep. So it's quite extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary situation. Fuck you. So that's a quick tour of the sort of the key countries. It's not over yet, and there's quite a lot of talk that other countries may also get involved. Now remember that the more the market talks about something happening, even if it's based on nothing but the market speculation about what the market might think about the market thoughts on stuff, those things can quickly become true. Slovenia's under the gun at the moment with people saying they're in big trouble. Malta's been under speculation since Cyprus went under because their economies are kind of near each other and both small islands, so therefore they're And interestingly, the Netherlands is actually starting to attract some attention from people who want to be the first ones to say, I knew that country was going to collapse before we made it collapse. The interesting reason why the Netherlands is being so heavily criticised is it runs a very high debt to GDP ratio, and it's a very dynamic economy, it's a very wealthy country, it pays its loans on time, but as a general principle it runs much higher debt, and in particular private sector debt is huge. The private citizens of the Netherlands have a huge amount of personal debt, and the argument is that if their banks get into trouble, they'll start calling in those debts, and things will quickly cascade into a very, very bad direction. Yeah, like another thing we have issues. So, who's to blame? And again, much like the US, there are lots of different versions of the story about whose fault it is if Europe gets yourself into this trouble. It's wise that you have a clear version of this story whenever you're doing these kind of debates, because otherwise you can't explain why what you want to do to fix them will work. The first blame usually goes to the governments of EU countries, and the argument says some of these countries like Greece, they clearly broke the rules. Not just by hiding stuff that's bad, but even if they hadn't been hiding stuff, they would have still broken the rules about the amount of debt you can run, the amount of inflation you can have. They just weren't following the Growth and Stability Pact rules, they weren't following the Maastricht Treaty rules. So they got themselves in trouble. This is exactly why those rules were there in the first place, to prevent governments from getting themselves into unrecoverable positions. They did the wrong thing. The problem with that story is that it's not just the countries who got smashed who are breaking the rules. Firstly, some of the countries that got smashed didn't break the rules, and some of the countries that did break the rules didn't get smashed. So the countries that are the quickest to point the fingers, Germany and France, Germany in particular, who have been the quickest to say, why are we responsible for this, you broke the rules. Germany was actually the first country to break Europe's rules. So it might be said that it's a convenient argument for the Germans to say that you broke rules, we broke, but you got caught and we didn't, so that's different. The second one is obviously consumers, and people want to say, well, European consumers obviously were living a lifestyle to which they were accustomed but unable to afford. Whose fault is that? Really no one's but their own. Maybe governments made it too easy on them. Maybe there was too much advertising by clever advertisers, but ultimately these guys made their own choices. The problem is that the kind of people who were racking up the most debt and doing the most ridiculous investments and pursuing the highest bid things are not the 54% of youth unemployed in Portugal. They're not the ones who racked up huge amounts of personal debt, but they're the ones who are paying the bills. It's not those who are in the wealthiest elite who have been the ones who have suffered the hardest in Europe. It have been those who quite clearly had nothing to do with it from a personal perspective. Some of them aren't even old enough to vote, so how they're held accountable is a bit of a mystery. And of course the other one is local and international banks, and they obviously lent too much to the wrong people. That's obvious because too many of the people they lent money to can't pay it back. But should they have been allowed to? What were the rules in place? Why were they allowed to get to that situation in the first place? Why didn't governments engage? So, solutions. It needs to be remembered that in Europe we're talking about three crises, right? Much like the US, it's a crisis of confidence, it's a crisis of debt, and it's a crisis of growth. And you need to be able to speak to all of those issues if you want to be able to have a solution that works. The first option that's usually talked about is someone leaves the euro, or the euro leaves everyone. The second one is not that we dissolve the euro or weaken the euro, but that we make the European Monetary Union stronger. So we either get divorced or we, get much closer together. And the third one is austerity and restructuring, particularly for the southern European countries. So let's quickly go through those. It's pretty easy to figure out why it would be better for southern or northern countries to leave the euro. It's worth pointing out there's actually no mechanism to force anyone out of the euro. So apart from the fact that debaters can say all kinds of shit that aren't true, it makes more sense to argue a case why certain countries should choose to leave the euro rather than arguing that Greece should be expelled from the euro because there's actually no mechanism for doing that. So that's problematic. But putting that aside, if there is any breakup of the euro, either in total or even if just a bunch of countries leave, the biggest victims of that, amongst the biggest victims of that, is certainly Germany and France, who between them export 40 or 60% of all their products and services to other European countries. So any breakup of the euro is going to smash those southern economies, right? The markets are going to punish them, their borrowing rate's going to explode, they're going to have to pick their own currencies again, which goes back to the weak, highly vulnerable currencies they had before. Obviously, the market's going to assume those weak and vulnerable currencies are in fact weak and vulnerable for good reason at current time. So it's going to be pretty bad. Those consumers aren't going to get better, they're going to get worse, which means the markets that Germany and France sell into are going to be like wastelands for quite some time. So even if Germany and France don't like the current situation, they probably like the alternative insofar as it's this one, even less. But arguably, it might eventually lead to greater growth if those southern countries could finally have a currency they could devalue, which would kind of artificially make them more competitive. Although you might think the way to become more competitive is not to do it artificially, to do it for real. The second one is greater political and economic integration, and this was actually talked about quite heavily during the sort of intensest period of the crisis, that maybe what needs to happen is Europe actually needs to get its shit together. And part of the issue with the European Monetary Union was it was kind of taking a very deep economic integration without having the complementary deep political integration that goes along with it. And sharing a currency is fine and all, and lots of countries, for example, have adopted the US dollar around the world, and there's certain benefits to be had from using a stronger, more stable currency than your own. But if you don't have a higher degree of economic and political integration in just sharing a currency, you're going to find yourself in all kinds of trouble, which is where Europe is at right now. So if that means you wanted to do things like Eurobonds, which is something that people talk about, if the European Central Bank could issue bonds at low interest rates, which these countries could buy to cover their debts and invest in productive infrastructure to help improve their competitiveness and therefore trade their way out of their debts, the only way that really makes sense is the European Central Bank has some taxation mechanism, because bonds require a degree of confidence. And if a bank is borrowing money without being able to tell investors one way or the other you're going to get paid, then no one's going to really want those bonds very much. But you can't do that without a much greater degree of integration. Greater labour movement will also be important. And again, this is one of those things that's talked about as a very scary thing, right? If Europe opened up its borders and let all its workers go around, there'd be no one left in Greece and they'd all be living in Germany. And the Turks would be everywhere and all this stuff. And look, there's some pretty obvious reasons why that wouldn't be the case. Not only because there just isn't enough jobs in Germany for everybody, and people would pretty quickly figure that out, but there are a whole lot of cultural and practical, linguistic reasons why people who don't speak German probably aren't going to go to Germany trying to find jobs. Would it mean that a certain number of workers, probably young workers in particular, would go to other countries looking for work? Yes, and that would be the point, right? That you would increase labour mobility, which would mean that those countries that were receiving labour would get lower labour rates. Those countries that those workers left wouldn't have to pay unemployment support for those people, and you would get remittances from those workers back to their home countries to help develop. So a certain amount of labour movement is good, but if the fear is that they'd be totally swamped, that seems improbable. And a fiscal union would allow the Europeans to coordinate spending much better. And so the US is a union, like the EU, but it's also a fiscal union as well as being a currency union, as in the federal American government can go on spending programs in the States. The European Central Bank doesn't have the power to go on spending sprees, and the European Commission doesn't have the power to authorise spending programs of a general nature within Europe. But we've seen good models of that, and like I said, we talked about Ireland in the post-accession years where it receives huge inflows of capital centrally from Europe as part of a predetermined process of assisting new entrant countries to kind of develop up to the standards of the core European countries. So we know it can work. It's maybe not the quickest approach ever, but we know that the European Union has been quite good in the past at helping countries with weaker economies develop, but they don't have a mechanism to do it in this context. And of course the third one would be austerity and restructuring. So the reason why you would pursue austerity is because it's a way to drive an internal devaluation. So if you can't make your currency weaker as a way of reducing imports and helping domestic consumers, helping domestic producers, then you can lower people's purchasing power, and that will mean they'll buy less imported goods because they'll be more expensive proportionally. Some of the internal devaluation costs is the way you do that is by either relaxing labour rules, which make labour cheaper, or you basically cut taxes on businesses to help them be more productive. We do that without breaking up the EU. Now, people have talked about Latvia as being an example compared to Iceland of where countries have pursued different approaches. So what does it look like for a country that got itself into all kinds of trouble in Europe that wasn't part of the Euro, and what can countries who are part of the Euro do? So Latvia has embarked on an aggressive internal devaluation campaign, slashing wages for the public sector and cutting taxes on business as a way of essentially having the same effect of having currency devaluation. Iceland went the other way. Iceland's focused on supporting its population rather than going on an austerity campaign to try to restore confidence by increasing spending and maintaining public sector employment. Now, the two are both seeing pretty good recovery from the crisis. Different people doing different things about whose is better. Latvia's certainly been more painful. So Latvia's gone through the dip you expect with austerity, but is starting to come back up. Iceland didn't go through that depth, but it's having slower growth. I guess the catch is Latvia still hasn't yet, despite the fact that it's the kind of poster child for the austerity movement at the moment, Latvia hasn't yet recovered the losses it's made in the global financial crisis or the European debt crisis yet. So for all its success, it's still behind, which is quite problematic. And that's it. Any questions before we run out of time? Yep.
To what extent does Britain get dragged into all that? Because it's not got the euro, but it's still kind of toying with the idea of being EU.
Yeah, I mean, if Europe, it's more a question of whether Europe breaks up or not. So if Europe maintains itself and is an effective economic unit, then that makes it harder for Britain because it makes it harder for them to enter that market because all those other countries are integrated. But if Europe broke up, then it would mean that there would be more opportunity for countries like Britain to kind of do, deals with those countries to get their trade in. Once you share a currency, it means the transaction costs for trading in other countries are much, much lower. So if that broke up, as well as if other agreements went. But at the moment, it's more. I mean, the British view about the EU seems to be more driven by a fear that somehow they'll get sucked into paying the bills for countries like Greece and elsewhere, rather than an actual obvious connection between the two.
It's a really
British.
in terms of, in a debating sense, how would you deal with the issue of trying to institute a monetary form that's since gone out of use, like for example the drachma in Greece, in a way that's both practical and achieves the benefits that people are trying to do? Because I've had to do debates about Greece before, and have struggled to try and deal with, well, we need a new currency, and I've tried to say, well, you use the drachma, and it's just been torn apart. How would you go about doing it?
Well, I'm not sure why it would be automatically torn apart. I mean, countries have changed currencies all the time. So Brazil instituted a totally new currency when it put the real in to replace the old currency. Lots of Latin American countries basically have gone back and forth between having the US dollar and having their own currencies and others. It's a complicated process, but I don't think you actually need to describe it in much detail in a debate. I mean, what they did in Brazil was they tied the new currency, they started using the new currency as a virtual currency. So the real existed in bank accounts, and all businesses were required to price their goods officially on their stickers in real, and then post on their on storefront what the exchange rate was between the real and the old currency. And it got people used to the idea that they were already basically trading in those currencies until the banks had printed enough of them, and then overnight all the government wages started getting paid in real, and there was a deadline set for people to go into banks and switch them over to real if they had hard currency, and it actually worked fantastically well. That was more about actually trying to defeat inflation, that they switched currencies because the view was that the old that high inflation in Brazil was really more of a function of an expectation of the market and of consumers of high inflation. But anyway, the point is, it was a very large country that was not anywhere near as advanced in their financial or government structures as European countries. And they managed to do it quite well. And there's plenty of other examples of countries who have, as I said, switched to the US dollar, or switched back from the US dollar to their own currency. And most of them actually haven't turned out to be disasters. Most of them have worked reasonably well.
Well, I was just going to add that Greece had the drachma for a lot longer than it had the euro. Like the euro is like a creature of the late 90s, and so to say that they wouldn't understand what the drachma was It's like, what is this money? I don't understand it. I can't recognize
How
it.
do I drive that?
But the argument is, well, but one that you always need to have currency, and one day there won't be enough currency.
Yeah.
Like the transition process is actually more obvious than that. Like you change over what's in people's bank accounts first, because it's all electronic money anyway, and then you just start like filling the ATMs with it.
It was just,
It's
and
complicated.
in terms of the EU, they would be kicked, but I don't know the process in which they would leave would be a very...
There's no
There is no mechanism, that's the thing.
Oh, well, think.
Presumably
If
it was
now,
announced,
they
there was
say-
just announced, and then at that point they could no longer use the euro, and it would have to be a very quick change to the drachma.
Sure.
And whereas you described a very ordered and very good process in Brazil, I don't know if that would still be able to apply.
Sure.
There's no reason why saying they have to get out means have to get out tomorrow. I mean, they can
Yeah.
say, look, we're going to take a 3-month process to transition out. In economic terms, that's incredibly quick.
Yeah,
But that doesn't. But administratively, that's plenty of time.
They'd probably have to slap capital controls in place, wouldn't they? Or else everyone would just pull their money out before it got converted into drachmas.
Well, the money that would be in people's bank accounts, you would just turn over straight away anyway. So that's where most of their economy is. Most of the currency economy is not in cash to begin with. So I think the capacity for capital flight would be after the fact anyway. So if you announce by saying we've pegged the currency, we're going to start with a pegged currency rate, and we've already converted all the bank accounts over.
Good luck to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to switch it out, you're fine, but you're not saving yourself anymore. It's already been done.
Same
Remember
time.
that it only matters, like having the currency change over only matters to the extent to which you're personally exposed to imports. So it doesn't mean that like your rent would go up. It doesn't mean that like your electricity bill would necessarily go up. Most people actually, the Australian dollar goes up and down all the time, and most people don't really notice it that much. I mean, the price of petrol changes a bit or whatever, and you pay slightly higher airfares or slightly lower airfares. But the average person, the average day, doesn't really notice currency speculation. It only really matters if you're involved in cross-border trade. That's when you notice. If you're a business, you'd be more concerned about it rather than an average person.
My original question was going to be about Eurobonds. My understanding is that there's no, if they were hypothetically to be implemented, there's no agreement on how liable countries would be for each other's debts.
Yeah.
What's the most likely version of them that would be implemented?
Well, I mean, the most likely version is one of two things. Either there would be an agreement on proportional exposure, so it'd be like the IMF and the World Bank and stuff, where there's an agreement up front about who pays what, and the UN works at this too, where every country's got an agreed proportion of costs that they pay, although the US is a bit tardy in paying theirs in the case of the UN, but everybody else, you do it that way. But this is why I think Eurobonds don't really make sense unless the ECB has a taxation power. And so if the ECB can pay taxes, can levy taxes, whether that's a transactions tax for financial transactions in the Eurozone, or whether it's some kind of like 0.5% on top of the goods and services tax, the VAT in Europe, or whatever it was, however it's levied, as long as the ECB's got its own taxation powers, it doesn't need to rely on the states to provide it with money. That's exactly why I think it needs it.